A heavy cavalry charge thunders toward you at 30 miles per hour. 2,000 pounds of horse and armored knight, the apex predator of medieval warfare, unstoppable as a freight train. The ground shakes. Your intestines turn to water. You're a peasant, holding a wooden stick with a crude iron tube lashed to the end, a weapon you barely understand, forged last week by a blacksmith who was guessing. You don't run. You wait. Your hands are shaking so badly you can barely light the fuse. Then you touch the powder, and the world explodes. Scree, a high-pitched whistle, tears through the air, the sound of hell itself. The lead ball punches through the knight's breastplate like it's parchment. The horse collapses mid-stride. The invincible warrior who trained his entire life for this moment, whose armor cost more than your village earns in a decade, is dead before he hits the mud. The weapon you just fired is called a pistola. In Czech, it means whistle. It's the great-grandfather of every firearm used today. That word traveled across borders and centuries, through German and French, to become the English word sitting in your vocabulary right now. Pistol. This weapon didn't just kill a knight, it killed the entire Middle Ages. The whole feudal order, built on the assumption that expensive training and expensive equipment would always dominate cheap bodies with cheap tools. And the man who put this weapon in your trembling hands, who taught you that you could kill a king, is Jan Žižka. But here's what makes this story truly insane. Žižka didn't just arm peasants and hope for the best. He built an army that never lost a single battle. And he did it while completely blind, unable to see the enemies he was destroying, the terrain he was exploiting, or even the sun in the sky. How does a blind man defeat 100,000 knights? How do you command an army when you can't see the battlefield? And why, 7 years after he died, did an entire crusade of hardened warriors flee in terror from the mere sound of his approach? Before we descend into this medieval nightmare of blood and innovation, if you're hungry for the brutal truths that textbooks sanitize, smash that like button and subscribe to Maproom Battles. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'm constantly amazed we can explore these revolutionary moments together from different corners of the world. Now let's meet the man who proved that constraints aren't limitations. They're catalysts for genius. History loves the young and the beautiful. Alexander the Great conquering Persia at 23. Napoleon crowning himself emperor at 35. Jan Žižka was neither young nor beautiful. He enters our story as a 60-year-old wreck with one eye already gone, gouged out years earlier in some forgotten skirmish, leaving a scarred, flat patch of skin on his face. He was destitute, a minor noble from Trochnov who'd spent decades as a mercenary doing the dirty work that kings were too polite to mention. He wasn't a hero from romance novels. He was a survivor who understood the ugly mathematics of street fights, who knew that honor gets you killed and pragmatism keeps you breathing. But in 1419, the kingdom of Bohemia wasn't looking for a hero. It was looking for an executioner who wouldn't flinch. The Catholic Church had just burned Jan Hus at the stake for the crime of suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the Bible should be available in languages people actually spoke, and that perhaps the clergy shouldn't be selling tickets to heaven. Hus' execution sparked a religious rebellion that threatened to tear the entire European power structure apart. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, they called him, the Red Fox, marched on Prague with the full blessing of the Pope. His mission was brutally simple: exterminate the heretics, burn the villages, kill the men, rape the women, erase this embarrassing challenge to church authority. Sigismund commanded the finest army in Christendom: trained knights, professional mercenaries, siege engineers, the whole medieval military-industrial complex. The Hussites had farmers, women, priests, and a one-eyed old man who'd spent his life learning how to kill people efficiently. It looked like a slaughter waiting to happen. Conventional military wisdom said the rebellion would be crushed within months. But Žižka saw something the emperor missed. He looked at these terrified peasants and didn't see victims. He saw engineers, a workforce that could turn farm wagons into mobile fortresses and grain threshing tools into weapons of industrial-scale death. He saw people who had nothing left to lose, which made them the most dangerous force on any battlefield. The test came immediately. In March 1420, at the Battle of Sudomier, Žižka was caught in the open, with only 400 followers, including women and children and 12 farm wagons. Charging at them were 2,000 Iron Lords, the elite royalist heavy cavalry representing everything the old feudal order could throw at the rebellion. The odds were 5-1. The terrain was a trap. The sun was setting. By every rule of warfare that had governed European conflict for centuries, Žižka was a dead man walking. But as the Iron Lords lowered their lances and spurred their horses, they weren't charging into a battle. They were charging into a meat grinder that would redefine what was possible. Geography dictates destiny. Žižka knew this like he knew his own scarred face. He stood on a narrow dam between two fish ponds. To his left lay the deep waters of Lake Mirzhavais. To his right, the empty bed of Lake Zorge, a drained pond that looked like solid ground, but was actually a deep, sucking quagmire of soft clay that could swallow a horse. He positioned his 12 wagons across the dam, creating a makeshift barricade. Then he waited, motionless, while his heart probably hammered and his remaining eye tracked the approaching thunder. The royalist commander, Bohuslav of Schwamberg, looked at this formation and laughed. He saw a dead end, peasants trapped against water with nowhere to run. The Iron Lords didn't bother with strategy or reconnaissance. Why would they? They were the tanks of the 15th century, the dominant military technology, unbeatable for 3 centuries. They lowered their visors, creating a narrow slit of vision that protected their faces but severely limited what they could see. They spurred their horses forward, aiming for the dry pond bed on the right flank, intending to sweep around the wagons and butcher the heretics from behind. The charge began with thunderous momentum. Hooves tore into earth, armor clanked, war cries echoed. But as the heavy war horses hit the bed of Lake Zorge, physics took over. The clay, deceptively firm on the surface, gave way under the massive weight. The momentum of the charge, all that kinetic energy that made cavalry so terrifying, vanished in seconds. Horses sank to their bellies, thrashing in panic. Knights in full plate armor weighing over 60 pounds tumbled from their saddles into the muck. And then the trap's second layer sprang. The Hussite women had done something peculiar before the battle. They'd taken off their long veils and spread them across the mud. To the knights, it looked like refuse or laundry dropped in panic. But as the dismounted knights tried to wade through the sludge toward solid ground, the jagged rowels of their spurs, those spiked wheels designed to control horses, snagged on the thick fabric. They tripped. They fell face first into suffocating clay. This was the moment Žižka had engineered with cold precision. The Hussites didn't fight with swords. They'd never trained with swords. They fought with tools they'd used their entire lives. The primary weapon was the flail, a long wooden staff with a heavy iron club attached by a chain. For generations, Czech peasants had used flails to thresh grain, beating the husks off wheat with rhythmic swings. Now, they threshed men. What would you do if you saw the invincible warriors who terrorized your village stuck helpless in mud? Would you show mercy? Or would you remember every humiliation? Keep that question close. The peasants swarmed the trapped knights like ants on a wounded beetle. They didn't aim for the gaps in the armor. They weren't skilled enough to find those weak points consistently. They didn't need to. They swung the flails with centrifugal force developed from years of threshing grain, bringing the iron clubs down on expensive German helmets with bone-crushing impact. The concussive force didn't need to penetrate steel to kill. It shattered skulls, broke necks, turned brains to jelly inside the helmets. The sound wasn't the romantic ring of sword-on-sword combat you see in movies. It was the wet, dull crunch of metal collapsing onto bone, of human bodies being processed like livestock. The Iron Lords were helpless. They couldn't stand up in the knee-deep mud. They couldn't swing their long swords effectively in the crushing press of bodies. Their expensive training meant nothing when they couldn't move. They were beaten to death like cattle in a slaughterhouse, and the peasants who killed them had spent their entire lives being treated as less than cattle. By nightfall, the pride of the Catholic cavalry lay broken in the mire. Bohuslav of Schwamberg, the arrogant commander who'd laughed at Žižka's position, was wounded and eventually captured. The survivors retreated into darkness, leaving behind their dignity, their dead, and their fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. Žižka stood among the carnage, one eye scanning the battlefield, his scarred face expressionless. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He analyzed with the cold precision of an engineer examining a successful prototype. Soudemierge proved that terrain could equalize odds, that peasant tools could kill noble warriors, that clever positioning trumped expensive equipment. But he knew he wouldn't always have a convenient swamp to hide behind. He needed a way to bring the fortress with him wherever he went. He looked at the blood-splattered farm wagons that had held his defensive line. They were sturdy, simple, made by people who understood wood and iron. If he could reinforce them, arm them, and link them together into a cohesive system, he could create a portable castle that moved. He was imagining the Wagenburg, the wagon fort that would revolutionize warfare and terrorize Europe for decades. To understand how a blind man defeated an empire, we need to understand his invention. History calls it the Wagenburg, but calling this machine a wagon is like calling a modern main battle tank a car. Technically accurate, but missing the revolutionary nature of the system. Žižka took the standard Bohemian farm cart and militarized every inch of it with obsessive attention to detail. He reinforced the sides with thick oak planks, creating ballistic shields capable of stopping crossbow bolts and early gunfire. On the bottom, he hung heavy chains that swept the ground, preventing enemy infantry from crawling underneath to hamstring the horses or set fires. On top, he installed retractable roofs to protect his crews from arrows raining down from the sky, medieval artillery falling in parabolic arcs that could kill you without warning. But the real genius wasn't the wood or the defensive features. It was the crew composition and coordination. Each wagon wasn't just a vehicle. It was a tactical unit, a squad of 18 to 20 specialists with specific, drilled jobs. You had the driver controlling the horses, 2 armed pavis bearers carrying large shields to cover the reloaders during combat, 6 crossbowmen providing accurate fire, 2 handgunners with the new pistolo weapons, 4 flailmen for close combat, 2 pikemen to defend against cavalry that got too close. This wasn't a mob throwing themselves at the enemy. This was an assembly line of death, a coordinated system where each person's role interlocked with everyone else's. Žižka drilled them relentlessly until they operated like a single organism, each specialist knowing exactly when to step forward, when to step back, when to reload, when to fire. When the enemy charged, the crossbowmen and handgunners fired in rotating volleys. As one row discharged their weapons, they stepped back to reload, while the shield-bearers stepped forward to provide cover. The pistola gunners didn't aim for accuracy, they couldn't. The weapons were too primitive. They aimed for noise and chaos. The high-pitched whistle and explosion of gunpowder, designed to spook enemy horses and shatter enemy nerves. And then there was the artillery. Žižka mounted small cannons on specialized carts positioned between the wagons. He called them Hufneis. The word meant crowd, because the cannon was designed to fire into masses of people. It was a short-barreled weapon, optimized for shrapnel rather than siege work, meant to turn human beings into hamburger at close range. This specific weapon, the Hufneis, is the etymological ancestor of the modern howitzer. Every time a military fires a howitzer today, They're using a weapon concept pioneered by a one-eyed Czech mercenary 6 centuries ago. When these wagons were linked together wheel to wheel by heavy iron chains, they formed a geometric fortress that could be assembled in minutes and disassembled just as quickly. It solved the eternal problem of infantry: how to withstand a cavalry charge in open terrain without castle walls to hide behind. Knights would charge, expecting the line to break like it always had for centuries. Instead, they hit a solid wall of oak and iron. Their horses would shy away from the gunfire and smoke, forcing riders to move parallel to the wagon wall rather than breaking through. That was the kill zone. As the knights stalled, frustrated and confused, Hussite flailmen and pikemen would reach out from the gaps between wagons. They'd hook riders with specialized tools, drag them off their saddles, and finish them on the ground where armor became a coffin rather than protection. It was brutal, efficient, and industrialized warfare as a manufacturing process rather than individual heroism. But the Wagenburg had one more secret that made it truly revolutionary. It wasn't just a defensive shell, it was mobile and adaptable. Žižka trained his drivers to execute complex maneuvers using flag signals visible across the battlefield. They could expand the circle to engulf an isolated enemy unit. They could open gaps to let their own cavalry out for counterattacks. They could reform the circle in different configurations depending on terrain and enemy tactics. Imagine a tank that can dismantle itself, transform into a fortress, and then reassemble to chase you down. That's what Emperor Sigismund was marching against. But the emperor, in his arrogance and ignorance, dismissed the intelligence reports. He called them mud-covered peasants and assumed this would be a simple, punitive expedition. He arrived outside Prague in summer 1420 with a massive crusader army, estimated between 50,000 to 100,000 men, the largest military force assembled in Central Europe in decades. The city of Prague was panicking. Hussite factions were arguing among themselves about theology, while an army of annihilation gathered outside their walls. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and their only hope was an old one-eyed mercenary with some modified farm wagons. Their only strategic advantage was a hill just outside the city walls. If the Crusaders took this hill, they could cut off Prague's supply lines and starve the city into submission within weeks. Žižka saw the map with crystalline clarity. Despite his limited vision, he took a small detachment of his Taborites, only a few dozen men and women, and occupied the hill. He ordered them to dig. They built 2 small log cabins and a defensive ditch. Against the glistening ocean of Crusader armor gathering below, it looked pathetic, suicidal. On the 14th of July, 1420, the flower of European chivalry looked up at that hill and saw a few dirt mounds defended by an old blind man and some farmers. They assumed it would be a quick skirmish before lunch, maybe not even worth the effort to put on full armor. They were about to ride into one of the most embarrassing military disasters in European history. And you need to understand, this wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was a psychological shattering that would echo through the next decade of warfare. The Battle of Witkov Hill was a masterclass in geometry defeating numbers. The hill itself was a narrow spine of rock, steep on both sides, offering only a thin path to the summit, where Žižka had dug his trenches. Sigismund commanded thousands of knights, the finest warriors in Christendom. But on that ridge, numbers became irrelevant. Only a few men could fight abreast. The emperor's massive army was like an ocean trying to force itself through a drinking straw. All that power, all that expensive training and equipment, compressed into a choke point where it became a liability rather than an advantage. The attack was led by the elite Knights of Meissen, German nobility who'd spent their entire lives training for combat. They were confident, glistening in plate armor worth fortunes, shouting insults at the heretics above. They charged up the slope, expecting peasants to flee at the sight of professional warriors. Instead, They ran into a wall of threshing flails wielded by men and women who decided that dying free was better than living on their knees. From the perspective of a Mycenae knight, the world transformed into a nightmare of claustrophobia. The path was too narrow to maneuver a warhorse effectively. The slope was slippery with summer grass and loose stones. As the front line stalled against Žižka's wooden palisade, the knights behind kept pushing forward with disastrous results. They were crushing their own comrades against the rocks, creating a human pileup where the warriors at the front couldn't retreat and couldn't advance. They were trapped in their expensive armor, being beaten to death by farmers with agricultural equipment. Žižka, despite his 60 years and failing sight, stood in the front trench. Chronicles say he fought with a sword in hand, guided by the sounds of the struggle, the clash of metal, the screams of the dying, the grunts of men swinging weapons. He held the line until he was nearly dragged into the enemy ranks by a grappling hook. The Crusaders were winning by inches. The sheer weight of their numbers and armor was beginning to break the wooden defenses. In another few minutes, they would overwhelm the Hussites through pure grinding attrition. But then the trap snapped shut with perfect timing. From the city gates of Prague below, a bell began ringing, not a church bell calling the faithful to prayer, but an alarm bell calling everyone to war. The southern gate threw open. A stream of reinforcements poured out, but these weren't professional soldiers. They were the common people of Prague, butchers with their cleavers, bakers with whatever they could grab, housewives armed with kitchen knives, and religious fury. They charged up the southern slope screaming religious hymns, and the sound was terrifying, thousands of voices unified in zealous rage. They slammed into the exposed flank of the Crusader column. Panic spread like wildfire. The knights at the rear, seeing a screaming mob charging them from an unexpected direction, assumed they were being surrounded by a massive army rather than a desperate civilian levy. They turned to run, but the path was blocked by their own men still pushing upward. The retreat turned into a stampede. Horses reared and plunged off the steep cliffs, taking their riders with them. Men in heavy armor tumbled down rocky slopes like stones, breaking limbs before they even hit the bottom. Emperor Sigismund watched from a distant command hill as his invincible crusade evaporated. He saw his elite cavalry trampling each other to death to escape a few dozen peasants and some screaming civilians. The psychological blow was devastating. The Red Fox realized these weren't just rebels, they were zealots who fought with a ferocity that mercenaries couldn't match because mercenaries wanted to survive to collect their pay. Sigismund withdrew his army in disgrace. He had himself crowned King of Bohemia in a hasty ceremony at St. Vitus Cathedral, just to save face, pretending he'd accomplished his mission. Then he fled the country, leaving the Hussites in control. The victory at Vitkov Hill changed everything. It solidified Žižka's status not just as a military commander, but as a prophet, a holy figure touched by God. The Hussites believed divine providence was personally directing his blade, but the war was far from over. While the external enemy retreated, internal politics were getting bloody, and for Žižka personally, the darkness was about to become absolute. He had defied kings and emperors, but he couldn't defy biology. He had one eye left, and fate was taking aim. During a minor siege at the castle of Rabi in 1421, either a stray arrow or a splinter of wood from a tree struck by cannonball found its mark. It hit his remaining good eye. The infection set in immediately. Medieval doctors tried everything their limited knowledge allowed, poultices, prayers, bloodletting, but the damage was irreversible. The general who'd revolutionized warfare was now completely blind. Most commanders would have retired. How can you lead an army when you can't see the terrain, can't read the enemy's formations, can't even distinguish day from night? But John Žižka was not most men. As his vision faded into permanent blackness, something remarkable happened. His mind expanded. He was about to demonstrate something that defies every assumption about military command. He would become a better general without his eyes, than he ever was with them. Think about that for a moment. What would you do if your primary tool for doing your job was suddenly taken away? Would you give up, or would you rebuild your entire approach from the ground up? Blindness usually ends a soldier's career before it begins. For Žižka, it merely removed the distractions, forcing him to develop a command system that was centuries ahead of its time. Inside his command tent, the world was pitch black, but in his mind, it was a grid of high-definition clarity, more accurate than what most sighted commanders could perceive. He couldn't see the battlefield, so he forced the battlefield to be translated into data pure, quantified information that his brain could process with computer-like precision. He surrounded himself with a team of trusted adjutants who became his eyes, but he didn't accept vague reports. The enemy is over. There was useless garbage. Žižka demanded specifics with obsessive precision. How steep is the slope in degrees? Is the mud ankle-deep or knee-deep, and is it clay or sand? Which way is the wind blowing the smoke and gunpowder fumes? Where is the sun relative to the enemy's visor? And will it blind them if they charge from that angle? How many wagons can fit abreast on that road? Can horses gallop on that surface, or will they stumble? He gathered these data points and constructed a dynamic, three-dimensional map in his head, constantly updating as conditions changed. Military historians compare it to a chess grandmaster playing blindfold, except instead of 32 pieces on 64 squares, Žižka was tracking thousands of soldiers across complex terrain with the knowledge that every miscalculation meant death. Once the map was constructed in his mind, he moved his units with terrifying precision. To control an army he couldn't see, Žižka invented a language of signals that cut through the chaos of medieval warfare. He couldn't rely on visual cues or personal observation, so he standardized a system of flag waves for the captains and drum beats for the soldiers. A specific rhythm meant reload, another meant close ranks, another meant rotate the wagons 90 degrees, another meant prepare for cavalry charge from the left. This wasn't improvisation, it was a coded communication system that turned battlefield chaos into synchronized action. This necessity for order led to the creation of Žižka's military ordinance in 1423, the first systematic military code of conduct in Central Europe. It was revolutionary because it didn't care about your social class, peasant or noble. Everyone followed the same rules. Stealing from civilians meant death. Disobedience to orders meant death. Breaking formation to chase loot meant death. He turned a chaotic religious mob into a professional machine that operated with the synchronization of clockwork. The soldiers ceased to be individuals making independent decisions. They became the limbs of the blind general's will. When he pointed a finger in the darkness of his tent, based on his mental map, 1,000 men moved in coordinated response in the sunlight outside. But this discipline and innovation were about to be tested against an impossible scenario. In late 1421, Emperor Sigismund returned with a new massive army, Hungarian cavalry, and German mercenaries to the town of Kutná Hora. This wasn't a siege, it was a trap, with Žižka as the prey. Kutná Hora was the silver mining capital of Europe, producing the wealth that funded kingdoms. The miners were German Catholics who hated the Hussites with religious fervor. Žižka marched his army to the city thinking he'd find a defensible position. Instead, he walked into betrayal so complete it seemed coordinated with Sigismund's arrival. The German miners inside the city slaughtered the Hussite garrison in a nighttime massacre and threw open the gates to the imperial army. Simultaneously, Sigismund's forces surrounded Žižka's camp from the outside. The blind general was trapped completely hostile city walls at his back, overwhelming imperial force in front. No food, no reinforcements, winter approaching. Sigismund rubbed his hands in delight. He'd finally cornered the blind dog. He decided not to attack immediately. Why waste soldiers when cold and hunger would do the work? He believed the Hussites would surrender by morning, begging for mercy. He was catastrophically wrong. Žižka wasn't planning surrender. He was calculating trajectories. While Žižka sat in his pitch-black tent constructing mental maps, a horror story was unfolding inside Kutna Hora's walls. The German miners weren't just killing Hussites, they were disposing of them in the most psychologically devastating way imaginable. They dragged captured partisans to the deep silver mine shafts, pits plunging hundreds of feet into the earth. They threw them in alive. One shaft alone, called Kujimska, reportedly became the grave of over 1,000 people. The screams echoing up from the darkness served as a grim warning to anyone thinking about surrender. Capitulation didn't mean slavery or ransom. It meant a long, dark death, falling through blackness, landing on the broken bodies of those who'd been thrown in before you. Outside, the temperature dropped. Snow began falling. Sigismund's army tightened the noose, confident and comfortable. The emperor went to sleep warm, believing the blind dog was finally caged. He expected desperate negotiation in the morning, perhaps an unconditional surrender. He woke up to the apocalypse. Žižka did the one thing a defensive army surrounded and outnumbered is never supposed to do. He attacked, but he didn't send men charging with swords in a desperate breakout attempt. He changed the entire geometry of the Wagenburg, transforming it from a static defensive circle into something nobody had ever seen before. He ordered the wagons to form parallel columns, a moving hallway of wood and iron, a mobile fortress that could advance rather than just sit and defend. At midnight on the 21st of December, 1421, in the freezing darkness, the Hussite army surged forward. They didn't spread out to engage the entire imperial line. They concentrated every ounce of firepower they possessed, every cannon, every handgun, every crossbow, onto a single narrow point in the enemy formation. It was the first instance of a mobile artillery barrage in human history, the conceptual grandfather of the Blitzkrieg. Imagine the scene from the perspective of an imperial soldier. You're shivering in the dark, half asleep, convinced the enemy is trapped and defeated. Suddenly, you see a wall of fire rushing toward you out of the blackness. The sound is deafening. Dozens of Hufnice cannons blasting shrapnel at point-blank range, carving a tunnel of meat and bone through your ranks. The horses of the Hungarian cavalry panicked, the sheer volume of noise and fire creating a psychological shockwave that propagated through the entire army faster than the actual projectiles. Žižka drove his entire army right through the hole he'd blasted in the enemy line. He didn't stop to fight or consolidate. He drove through them like a spear through flesh and vanished into the countryside beyond. By the time Sigismund realized what had happened, the Hussites were gone. The emperor thought he'd won. He assumed Žižka had fled in terror, that the blind general was running for his life. So Sigismund let his troops disperse to find warmth and loot the abandoned Hussite camp. He declared victory and began planning his triumphal return. 2 weeks later, the ghost came back. Have you ever had someone underestimate you so completely that you could turn it into a weapon? That's exactly what Žižka did next. Žižka hadn't run away to hide or lick his wounds. He'd run away to refit, rearm, and recruit. He reinforced his army with fresh volunteers inspired by his impossible escape, turned around, and marched back at double speed. He caught the imperial army completely unprepared at the village of Nebovidi. The hunters became the prey. Sigismund's forces, scattered and drunk on premature victory, collapsed when the defeated Hussites came roaring back. The retreat turned into a rout as imperial soldiers fled in panic across the frozen Sazava River. The ice gave way under the weight of their armor. Hundreds of knights drowned in freezing water, pulled down by the steel that was supposed to protect them. Their expensive armor became their tomb. Žižka had not just escaped a trap. He turned it into a mass grave for his enemies, demonstrating that in his mind, every retreat was just preparation for a more devastating counterattack. Victory is dangerous. When the external enemy disappears, the internal knives come out, and ideological purity becomes more important than survival. With Emperor Sigismund beaten back repeatedly, the Hussite movement began fracturing along theological lines. You had the moderates in Prague, rich merchants and nobles, who just wanted to receive communion in both kinds and go back to making money. Then you had the radicals in Tabor Žižka's people, who wanted to burn the entire feudal system to the ground and rebuild society from scratch based on biblical principles. The tension erupted. The warriors of God turned their flails against each other, but Žižka had no patience for theological debates or political maneuvering. To him, discipline was binary. You were either a soldier of Christ following orders, or you were an obstacle to be removed. When a sect of Hussite extremists called the Adamites began roaming the countryside naked, claiming they were living in the Garden of Eden before the fall, and practicing communal property and free love, Žižka didn't convene a council to debate their theology. He marched on their island hideout on the Žižka River, slaughtered them systematically, and burned the survivors. He was the revolution's immune system, ruthlessly attacking any infection that weakened the body, even when that infection came from within. The nobles of Prague, watching this terrifying old blind man eliminate anyone who questioned his authority, decided he was too dangerous to live. They formed a coalition to crush him, believing they had advantages. They knew his tactics. They had their own Wagenburgs. They understood his system. They were catastrophically wrong. In June 1424, at the Battle of Malashov, Žižka faced his own countrymen, Hussites, who'd learned from him, who'd fought beside him, who knew every trick in his playbook. The Prague coalition had superior numbers, better equipment, and intimate knowledge of the Wagenburg system. Žižka retreated to a high ridge overlooking a narrow valley, and the Prague forces pursued, thinking the old blind dog was finally running for his life. They were wrong. Žižka was preparing a new surprise that would prove his tactical genius transcended any single weapon system. He'd ordered his men to fill several baggage wagons with heavy rocks, not for fortification, but for kinetic energy. He lined these multi-ton weapons up at the very edge of the hill's crest and waited until the Prague army was densely packed in the valley below, struggling up the slope in their heavy armor. Then he gave the signal. The Hussites didn't fire cannons or discharge handguns. They simply pushed the rock-filled wagons over the edge. These improvised missiles roared down the hill, gathering terrifying speed, smashing into the Prague infantry and crushing men while shattering their formation before a single shot was fired. The psychological impact was devastating. Your own countrymen using your own wagon technology against you in a way you'd never imagined. The lines broke in panic. Before the dust even settled, Žižka ordered a general charge. His cavalry and infantry swept down the hill like an avalanche of religious fury. It was a massacre. The road to Kutná Hora was littered with the bodies of Hussites killed by Hussites, brother against brother. Malashov was Žižka's tactical masterpiece, proving that even against enemies who knew his entire playbook, his ability to improvise and innovate in real time was unmatched. After Malashov, no one in Bohemia dared whisper against him. He'd become the undisputed master of the land through a combination of tactical genius and ruthless elimination of rivals. But he wasn't satisfied with defense or domestic control. He realized that to secure Bohemia permanently, he had to make its neighbors bleed so badly they'd never dare invade again. He turned his sightless gaze outward, toward the borders of Hungary and Austria. He was done waiting for crusades to come to him. He was going to bring the apocalypse to them, to make the cost of attacking Bohemia so high that no rational ruler would ever consider it. By 1423, Žižka had solved the problem of survival. Now he wanted retribution on an industrial scale. He realized that passively waiting for crusaders to invade Bohemia was a strategic error. It let the enemy choose when and where to fight. To end the war permanently, he needed to make it too expensive for the enemy to continue. He initiated a new strategy: offensive raids deep into Hungary and Moravia, Historians later gave these expeditions a romantic name, Spanile Hizdi, the beautiful rides. But if you were a German villager or Hungarian noble, there was absolutely nothing beautiful about them. They were campaigns of calculated terror, designed to destroy the enemy's will to fight. Žižka's wagons rolled across borders, not to conquer land. He had no interest in holding territory outside Bohemia, but to burn resources and break spirits. They struck deep into enemy territory, seized food, cattle, gold, and anything else of value, then left trails of smoke behind them as warnings. The psychological impact was more devastating than the physical damage. The mere rumor that the Blind One was approaching caused entire regions to panic. Castles that had stood for centuries surrendered without firing a shot. Armies melted away before battles began, their soldiers deserting rather than face the legendary wagon fortress. Žižka had achieved the ultimate goal of any general. He defeated the enemy's mind before engaging their body. Fear had become his most effective weapon, more powerful than any cannon or handgun. In 1424, Žižka marched to besiege the castle of Pribislav. He was at the height of his power, having united the fractious Hussite armies under his iron command. He remained one of history's few undefeated military commanders, having fought over a dozen major battles and countless skirmishes without a single loss. He was 64 years old, completely blind, and seemingly immortal. But while he could defeat emperors and armies, he couldn't defeat biology. A microscopic assassin was waiting for him. While inspecting the siege lines at Pribislav, a large, painful boil, a carbuncle, appeared on his body. It was likely bubonic plague, the Black Death that stalked every medieval army. Like an invisible demon, the infection spread rapidly through his bloodstream. The man who'd survived arrows, swords, maces, and cannonballs was being eaten alive from the inside by bacteria too small to see. On the 11th of October, 1424, Jan Žižka died. The silence that followed must have been terrifying for his soldiers. The Hussites didn't just lose a general, they lost their prophet, their father figure, the man who'd taught them that peasants could kill kings and that faith combined with technology could defeat any earthly power. In their grief, his soldiers did something that reveals how completely he'd become their identity. They officially renamed themselves. They were no longer just Taborites or Hussites. They called themselves Siratsi, the orphans. They felt abandoned, lost, without the blind father who'd guided them through darkness. But Žižka had left them one final instruction, a command so grotesque and heavy with psychological warfare symbolism that it blurred the line between history and myth. According to legend, he ordered that his skin be flayed from his body and stretched over a giant war drum. He wanted to continue leading the charge, even from beyond the grave. He wanted his enemies to hear his voice, the boom of the drum, and tremble at a sound that had preceded their defeat so many times before. Whether this actually happened or whether it was propaganda, the orphans spread to terrorize their enemies almost doesn't matter. The legend itself became a weapon. What matters is what happened 7 years later, when the power of that legend was tested against the largest crusade Europe had ever assembled. August 14, 1431. 7 years have passed since Žižka's death, and the Catholic Church has declared a fifth crusade against the Hussites. This time, they're absolutely certain of victory. The blind sorcerer is rotting in his grave. The Hussites are leaderless orphans, fragmenting into factions. Surely this time, overwhelming force will crush the heretics. A massive imperial army, led by Cardinal Julian Cesarini, over 100,000 strong, perhaps the largest crusading force assembled since the First Crusade crosses the Bohemian border near the town of Domajlice. They're confident, numerous, loud, bristling with the finest equipment Christian Europe can produce. But as they penetrate deeper into the Bohemian forests, a strange sound begins drifting through the trees. It isn't the clash of steel or the roar of cannons. It's singing, thousands of voices synchronized and deep, chanting a low, menacing melody. It's the Hussite battle hymn, "Ye who are warriors of God and of his law." To the superstitious minds of the German knights, this wasn't just a song. It was an incantation, a spell being cast by demon worshippers. As the hymn grew louder, it was joined by a rhythmic mechanical rumbling. The earth began to shake. It was the sound of hundreds of iron-bound wagons rolling over hard ground. Thump, 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 and then the panic set in. Legend says that the Crusaders didn't even see the Hussite army. They just heard the sound. In their minds, the ghost of Jan Žižka had risen from hell to lead the charge. The myth of the skin drum played directly into their deepest fears. The idea that the blind general was personally beating the rhythm of their death. A collective psychosis swept through the imperial ranks. Seasoned knights who'd fought in dozens of battles began sweating, hyperventilating. The cardinal tried to rally them, shouting about God's will and eternal salvation, but it was useless. The terror was contagious, spreading faster than any plague. Before a single arrow was loosed, before a single lance was lowered, before the two armies even made visual contact, the entire crusade disintegrated. 100,000 men turned and ran. They dropped weapons, armor, banners, anything that slowed them down. They trampled each other in desperate bids to escape the invisible monster approaching through the trees. Cardinal Cesarini himself had to disguise himself as a common soldier to escape the rout, leaving behind his cardinal's hat, his crucifix, and the papal bull authorizing the crusade. When the Hussites arrived, they found an empty battlefield littered with enough gold, supplies, and weapons to fund their war for another decade. They didn't have to fight. The memory of Jan Žižka had fought for them. This event at Domažlice is unique in military history, a victory won entirely by reputation, by the psychological trauma one man had inflicted so deeply on the European consciousness that his name alone, 7 years after his death, functioned as a weapon of mass destruction. The orphans chased the fleeing crusaders all the way to the border, cutting down stragglers, proving that while the father was dead, his children were very much alive and utterly unforgiving. The Catholic Church finally realized something that should have been obvious years earlier. The Hussites could not be defeated by force. The invention of the Wagenburg, the Pischala, the systematic military discipline, and the psychological terror of the blind general had permanently changed the rules of warfare. For the first time in its history, the Church was forced to do something it had always refused: negotiate with heretics as equals. The Hussite Wars eventually ended not with military victory, but with diplomatic signature. In 1436, the Catholic Church, exhausted and humiliated by over a decade of defeats, signed the Compacts of Basel. For the first time in history, the Church officially negotiated with heretics and granted concessions. The Bohemians received the right to receive communion in both kinds, bread and wine, instead of just bread, which sounds minor but represented a fundamental challenge to church authority. It was a victory won by the iron will of a man who'd been dead for 12 years. But Jan Žižka left behind far more than a peace treaty. He left a blueprint for the future of violence that echoes through every modern conflict. Look at a modern main battle tank. It's heavily armored, carries a large cannon, and uses machine guns to suppress infantry. It is, in essence, a mechanized Wagenburg. Žižka was the first military theorist to realize that firepower needs mobility and protection to be strategically decisive. He didn't just invent a tactic, he invented the fundamental concept of armored warfare that would dominate the 20th century. And then there's the linguistic legacy. Every time a police officer draws a pistol, every time a soldier holsters a sidearm, they're paying unconscious tribute to the Czech pištěla, those whistling pipes that Žižka's peasants used to shatter the age of chivalry. He took gunpowder technology that the Chinese used for fireworks and Europeans used for siege engines, and he put it into the hands of common people. He democratized death, proving that expensive training and expensive equipment could be defeated by cheap technology wielded by motivated believers. Think about what that means. Žižka didn't just win battles, he fundamentally redistributed military power away from aristocratic elites toward common people. He proved that the future belonged not to knights, but to whoever could best harness industrial-scale violence. If you visit Prague today, you can climb Vítkov Hill, where 26 defenders held off thousands. Standing there, overlooking the city he saved, is a colossal bronze statue of Jan Žižka, the third largest bronze equestrian statue in the world. He sits on his horse, mace in hand, staring out over the capital with eyes that cannot see, yet seeing more than any king of his era. Was Žižka a hero of oppressed people fighting for religious freedom, or a fanatical tyrant who used faith as an excuse for brutality? History doesn't offer simple answers about men who operate at the extremes of human capability, who achieve the impossible through methods that make us uncomfortable. But one thing is undeniable. He proved that asymmetry is a weapon. An army of amateurs, armed with conviction and adaptive technology, can dismantle an empire of professionals who assume their dominance is permanent. He showed us that constraints, even complete blindness, aren't barriers to success. They're catalysts for innovation, if you're willing to completely rebuild your approach. He didn't fight the way war was supposed to be fought according to centuries of aristocratic tradition. He fought the way it needed to be fought to survive against overwhelming odds. He remains the only fully blind commander in history to fight multiple major battles and never lose a single one. He was the undefeated, the one-eyed, then no-eyed, the ghost of Bohemia, whose psychological impact outlived his body by decades. And his legacy lives on every time someone picks up a pistol, every time an armored vehicle moves across a battlefield, every time asymmetric warfare defeats conventional power. If you've made it this far through blood, innovation, and the triumph of the impossible, please subscribe to Maproom Battles and hit that notification bell. These forgotten stories of how ordinary people defeated extraordinary power need to be remembered and studied. Drop a comment telling me, do you think Žižka was a hero fighting for religious freedom, or a fanatic who used faith to justify violence? I read every response, and I'm genuinely curious about your perspective on this complex figure. Thanks for exploring the dark genius of medieval warfare with me. Until next time, keep questioning the assumptions that everyone else accepts as permanent truth.